Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the Quantitative Results chapter. Just before we get started with the presentation, I would like to present this information in case you are interested in additional support outside of this webinar. So we do offer assistance with all aspects of the dissertation. So if you are interested in more one-on-one support outside of these webinars, you can use the information that you see here to contact us and learn more about the types of assistance that we provide. Just to give an overview of what we're going to be covering today, this webinar will be on the quantitative results chapter, so we will not be covering information about qualitative results today, only quantitative. And we'll start off by discussing the purpose and importance of the results chapter to the dissertation. And then we're going to go over all of the different components that are typical for the quantitative results chapter. So including the introduction, the data collection and preparation, descriptive statistics, assumptions testing, analyses of the research questions, and the summary. And then at the end of the session, we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions. So if you do have questions during the presentation, you can type those into the question section. And any questions that aren't answered over the course of the presentation, I'll be answering at the end. So we will be saving the question section for the end of the presentation. So let's just start by talking about why the results chapter is important to the dissertation. So the purpose of the results chapter is to present the data and the analyses that conducted to answer the research questions and hypotheses of the study. The preceding chapters of the dissertation are meant to establish why and how you are conducting your research. By the time you get to your results chapter, you have your data collected, you're doing your analysis, and now it's time to describe to the reader exactly what you found and what the answers to your research questions are. So in the results chapter, you want to present the findings for each research question hypothesis and make sure you have a clear statement that answers each of those. So by the end of your results chapter, you should have an answer to every single research question. But you want to save interpretation beyond that for the discussion chapters. So you don't really want to get into interpretation in terms of what the results mean for the literature or the more broader implications of the results, because that information goes in the discussion chapter. And it's important to note that although we are going to be covering the sections that are most typical for the results chapter based on our experience with a lot of different schools, it's important that you follow your specific school's requirements and guidelines for the results chapter. So it's possible that your school may require different sections, they may require more sections or fewer sections, or the sections that they want may contain slightly different information than what we present today. You want to make sure that you defer to your specific school and degree program's guidelines for formatting and completing your results chapter. So now let's talk about the different components of the chapter. And like the other chapters of the dissertation, the results typically starts off with a short introduction where you reorient the reader to the purpose of the study and the research questions. So you can generally just start by restating the purpose of the study. This can just be a verbatim restatement of your purpose statement or an abbreviated version of the purpose statement. You'll want to restate your research questions and hypotheses, and it's important to note that throughout the dissertation, the research questions and hypotheses should be stated in the exact same way whenever they appear. So the wording of the research questions and hypotheses should never change throughout your document. And then after that, you can simply outline the contents of the results chapter. And this can be as simple as just listing off the different section headings that will appear in the chapter. Next, you'll want to talk about the results of your data collection and the steps that you take to prepare the data. So you'll want to summarize your data collection procedures and note any changes from your originally proposed procedures. And this is really important because when you do your methodology chapter in your proposal, you might propose a certain method of data collection, but by the time you get to your results, it's possible that some changes to your data collection actually changed from what you um, originally proposed. So you might not have been able to carry out the data collection in the exact same way that you had originally thought you were going to do. And so if there are any procedures that were different from what you originally proposed in your proposal phase and your methodology chapter, it's important to note those changes. Different schools will have different ways that they want you to go about this. Some schools will want you to just note the changes in the results chapter and keep the methodology chapter the same. But other schools may actually want you to go back and revise your methodology chapter to reflect the data collection procedures that you actually followed from what you originally proposed. But ultimately, it's just important to note if there are any changes to these procedures compared to what you had originally proposed. In terms of the data collection, you'll want to talk about your response rate and any attrition in the data. So you'll want to talk about things like how many total responses you received. So if you're doing a survey study, for instance, how many total people responded to your survey? You'll want to talk about loss of any of those responses. So do you have to remove or exclude any participants for various reasons? So participants who may have been missing data or participants who didn't meet some of your inclusion criteria. So you'll want to identify those, how many participants there were and why you had to exclude them. And after you go through that process of explaining any cases or participants that you have to exclude, you'll want to report what your final total sample size was. And in some cases, you may need to do a post hoc power analysis if your target sample size is not met. Not all schools require this, but some schools will require post hoc power analysis in certain situations. Some will require it if your sample size wasn't met. Some will require it in any situation where you'd had non-significant results. But it may be a possibility that you'll have to conduct a post hoc power analysis in this section of the dissertation. I won't go into a lot of detail about procedures for power analysis in this presentation because we do have other webinars that are specifically dedicated to power analysis. So if you're more interested in that topic, I'd direct you to those specific webinars. Then after you talk about those data collection procedures and the result of your data collection, you'll want to discuss the preliminary steps that you take to prepare the data. So this can involve checking the data for accuracy, handling missing responses, and checking for outliers. Can also involve coding or recoding data, such as if you have survey data and survey responses that need to be reverse coded, you may need to include details about that, and include information about computing composite scores for any relevant variables. So if you're, again, doing like a survey study and you have survey instruments that include multiple items that measure a certain variable, how are you going to compute a score for those items to get a score for the variable that you're using in your analysis? Now, in terms of checking the data for accuracy, this is especially important if you are manually entering data from, for instance, a paper and pencil survey. So if you had people physically complete a survey through paper and pencil methods, and you had to enter the data yourself into an electronic format, you'll want to check that data for accuracy to make sure that the responses are correct and you don't have any invalid responses. You'll also want to go into detail about how you're handling missing data. So it's very likely that you're going to have participants or cases that have some missing data, and you'll need a plan for how you're going to deal with that. So are you going to just exclude all participants if they have any missing data at all and only include people that have 100% complete responses? Or are you going to try to include participants who are maybe just missing a few responses or a certain percentage of responses? And if so, how are you going to handle those missing responses? Are you going to try to replace or impute those values in some way? Or are you going to handle the missing responses using some other method? So you want to be very detailed about how you are handling those issues. And so here are just a couple of examples of how you might present the data collection section of the results chapter. So here's just an excerpt where we say, the total number of survey responses that we received. We say that we're going to exclude participants who were missing a certain level of missing responses. And then we state our final total sample size. And then we say how we're going to handle the remaining missing responses using a imputation. And here's just another example, a little bit of a longer excerpt that has a little bit more detail about the data collection. So we talk about the time frame that the data collection took place. We again talk about the total number of participants that responded to the survey. We talk about participants that were dropping for various reasons, whether they didn't agree to the consent, or they had missing values, or they didn't meet inclusion criteria. And then we state our final total sample size. And then here's just a short excerpt of how you might write up a post hoc power analysis. So we state that we're conducting a post hoc power analysis for a couple of different analyses that we're doing. We state the analysis, and then we state the power that we achieved with that analysis with the sample size that we actually obtained. So now let's talk about the descriptive statistics. Generally, before you get into the analysis of your research questions, you'll present descriptive statistics for your variables and demographic information for your participants to characterize your sample. So you'll want to present relevant descriptive statistics for your demographics and your variables of interest, or the variables in your research questions. So you may want to present frequencies and percentages for categorical variables. So those would be variables like gender or ethnicity. And then statistics like means and standard deviations for continuous variables such as age in years or GPA. If possible, you may want to compare the demographic characteristics of your sample to characteristics of the population. And this is just to give a reader an idea of the representativeness of your sample. So if you do have population characteristics available, you may want to note in your results chapter how closely the characteristics of your sample resemble the characteristics of the population. So for instance, is the percentage of males and females in your sample similar to what we see in the population? And then finally, if you have survey instruments, for instance, that use Likert scales or multiple items to measure a construct, you may want to present reliability coefficients for those measures. So some schools will require you to compute reliability for measures to report in your own study. So you may need to report Cronbach's alpha for measures to which that applies. And so here are just some examples of how you might present the descriptive statistics for your study. So here's just an example of a short excerpt and a table showing frequencies and percentages for categorical variables. And one thing to note is that when you have tables in your results section, you want to make sure that one, you always reference the table in the text. So you should never have a table that you do not reference in the text. So we see here that we make a specific reference to our table. And you also want to make sure that that table appears close to where it is referenced. So typically right after the paragraph in which you reference the table. So for instance, you don't want to introduce a table and then the table doesn't appear until 5 pages later. The table should appear very close to where you actually reference it in the text. And so we just have a little bit of narrative here explaining what's in the table, and then the table showing the full frequencies and percentages for all the categories. And here's an example of a table for continuous measures. So we see here that we have minimum and maximum values as well as mean and standard deviation for various continuous variables. And then here we have an example of how you might report reliability coefficients or Cronbach's alphas. So we see that we have a table here showing the Cronbach's alpha and the number of items for each of these constructs in our study. So after you've gone through the descriptive statistics, you can start getting into the discussion of the actual analyses that are intended to address your research questions. But each of those analyses will likely have assumptions that need to be tested in order to confirm the validity of the analysis. And so sometimes assumptions testing will be presented in its own dedicated section prior to the actual results of the analysis, or sometimes you just present the assumptions testing alongside each analysis that you describe. And so you'll want to defer to your school's specific guidelines for how they want you to present the information about the assumptions testing. But you do want to make sure that you list and discuss each of the required assumptions tests for each analysis that you're conducting. So for each assumption that you need to test, you want to state how the assumption was tested. So for instance, if you are doing something like a t-test and you need to test for normality, how are you testing for normality? Are you using something like a Shapiro-Wilk test? Or are you using a graphical method like a histogram or a normal probability plot? Or are you using a different descriptive method like skewness and kurtosis values or something along those lines? So you want to state how you're testing the assumption. You want to interpret that test. So say what the result of the assumptions test is, and make a clear statement about whether the assumption was met or not. And then if the assumption was not met, you want to describe any action that you took to account for the fact that the assumption was not met. And so here are some examples of how you might describe assumptions testing. So here we're doing a test for normality using a normal PP plot. And we see we have a little bit of narrative saying that we're testing normality by examining this normal PP plot. And we make an interpretation of this plot saying that the data did not significantly deviate from normal. And we state that the assumption is met. And then we present our plot in this figure. And then here's another example of describing some other assumptions test. In this case, we have an example where one of our assumptions was not met. So in this case, we actually detected an outlier which you see in the highlighted portion here. And we describe how we're accounting for this. We're saying that we're excluding this outlier from our analysis. Then once you've described your assumptions testing, you can actually start describing the results of the analysis for your research questions. And you want to organize this section by research question or hypothesis, and just do it in order of your research questions, how they appear in the rest of your dissertation. So if you have 5 research questions, then you just want to go through each of those research questions 1 through 5, starting with research question 1. You don't want to kind of jump around and start with research question 2 and then go to research question 4 and then do research question 1. You want to present your analyses in a logical order. And like the data collection procedures, you want to note any changes from the originally proposed data analysis procedures. So in your methodology section, it's likely that you had a specific data analysis plan. But again, if you had changes in your data collection procedures and changes to the actual data that you're able to obtain for your results, then it's possible that you may actually have to change your data analysis plan. So if you do have to change the type of analysis that you have to do from what you originally proposed, you want to note those changes. And for each analysis, you want to clearly identify the variables that you're using in the analysis. So independent and dependent variables, predictor and criterion and covariate variables for regression analysis, for example. And you want to report the appropriate statistics associated with each of the tests. So things like p-values, T and S statistics for those types of tests, effect sizes, and confidence intervals. And if you're doing an analysis that requires post hoc testing, you'll want to report the results of those post hoc tests. So an example of this would be an ANOVA that was significant, and you have to do post hoc tests to see exactly which groups are different from each other. In that case, you'd want to report the results of those post hoc tests. And importantly, you want to include a clear statement that answers each research question or hypothesis based on the result of the analysis. So you should be able to interpret the analysis, which is usually done by looking at the p-value and comparing that to your significance level to determine if the results are significant or not. And you want to take that result and turn that into a clear statement that answers the research question or addresses the hypothesis. So if, for instance, you have hypotheses written in null and alternative format, you'll probably want to make a statement about the null hypothesis. So whether the null hypothesis was rejected, if your results were significant, or if the null hypothesis was not rejected, or if you failed to reject the null hypothesis, if the results were not significant. So now let's go through a few examples of how you might write up the results for different statistical tests. And in this first example, we look at the results for an independent samples t-test. So here we see that we state the analysis that we're conducting, we're saying we're doing a t-test. We're stating what our independent and dependent variables are. Then we present the results of the t-test, including our t-statistic. And when you present the t-statistic, you want to include the degrees of freedom in parentheses next to the t-statistic, our p-value, and a measure of effect size, which for a t-test would often be Cohen's d. And we make an interpretation of that test. We say the results of the t-test in this case were not significant because our p-value is greater than 0.05. It indicates that there are no differences in the scores. and we make a clear statement about our hypothesis. We say the null hypothesis was not rejected. And then we have a table to display any other relevant statistics for the test. In this case, for a t-test, you might show the means for each of the groups that you're comparing. Here we'll look at an example, again, for an independent samples t-test, but in this case, we show a result that is significant. So again, we say what test we're doing, we state our independent and dependent variables, we show the results of the test, but this time our p-value is less than 0.05, so we say it's significant. So there are significant differences between the groups. And we can state that our null hypothesis was rejected. Here's an example of a write-up for an analysis of variance. So again, we state what analysis we're conducting, and we state our independent and dependent variables. We report the statistics relevant to the ANOVA. In this case, for the F statistic, you'll always have 2 degrees of freedom in the parentheses, one for the numerator degrees of freedom, which is the first number, and then the second number is the denominator degrees of freedom, our S statistic, and our p-value. In this case, our test is not significant, and we do not reject the null hypothesis. And again, we present a table of descriptives showing the means for the different groups. Now here's another example. This time we're looking at an example for a Pearson correlation analysis. So we can say, we're stating our research question. We are stating what analysis we're conducting, saying that we're conducting a Pearson correlation. Then we show our correlation coefficients and p-values for those. And we do have significant correlations here. So we state that those are positive correlations, and we can say that our null hypothesis is rejected because we had significant correlations. And here we also just have a table showing our correlation coefficients here. And here's an example of how you might do a write-up for a regression analysis. So for a regression, you may first talk about the results of the overall regression model, which is displayed as an F-test, where you, again, may present the F statistic, the p-value. You may also present the R-squared value, which is the percentage of variance explained. If your hypothesis is about the significance of the overall regression model, in this case, our regression model is significant, so we reject the null hypothesis, and our outcome is significantly explained by the predictors. And if your regression model is significant, you may want to present a table of the individual regression coefficients to see exactly which individual predictors are significant, and talk about which of those predictors are significant in the narrative. So in this case, it looks like sex is a significant predictor of our outcome. And after you've gone through the results for each of the research questions, you'll usually end the chapter with a summary that either summarizes the contents or just the findings that address the research questions. So in the summary, you'll want to restate the answer to each research question hypothesis. So again, restate whether each hypothesis was rejected or not rejected. And then after you summarize those results, you can just provide a transitioning statement to your discussion chapter. And that brings us to the end of the presentation on the different components of the results chapter. And again, if you are interested in additional support outside of these webinars, you can use the information that you see here to contact us and learn more about the different types of assistance that we provide. And now I will start answering questions. So if you do have any questions, you can feel free to type those into the questions section now. And I will do my best to answer your questions. I'll just look and see what questions we have so far. And so one question is, I'll be performing a correlation analysis, not regression modeling. What might be my requirements for reliability validity testing? Should I still always present basic descriptive metrics? So to answer that second part, it usually is common to always present some kind of descriptive statistics because it'll give your reader at least an idea of the characteristics of your sample and the characteristics of the variables that you measured in your study. In terms of reliability and validity, that's kind of separate from doing just the correlation analysis to answer a research question. So for instance, if you're doing a correlation, your research question probably has to do with the relationship between two variables. That's different from testing the reliability and validity of the measures of those variables. Usually in a study like this, you are not necessarily testing the validity of instruments because schools will typically require you to use instruments that have already been validated. So if that's the case, you may not have to go into a lot of detail about reliability and validity testing, or even do your own reliability and validity tests, with the exception of maybe computing some basic Cronbach's alpha coefficients on your data, if you're using an instrument that is already validated in the literature. But if you did need to do validity testing for your instruments, those would be a little bit different from just a regular Pearson correlation analysis that usually involves more in-depth analysis like a factor analysis to test for validity. And another question is it better to say the null hypothesis was supported or the null hypothesis is not rejected? So this can come down to the preferences of your committee members and your schools, depending on how they want this worded. But generally, it's good practice to say if your result was significant that you reject the null hypothesis, because really when you do these types of analysis, you're doing it through the logic of null hypothesis testing. And so you're really making a statement about the null hypothesis. So if your results are significant and there are significant relationships between variables or significant differences between groups, typically your null hypothesis is that there was no relationship or there was no difference. So your statement is generally that you are rejecting that hypothesis of a null relationship or no differences. People may also want you to make a statement about your alternative hypothesis. It's often not necessary, but if they do, then you would generally say something like the alternative hypothesis was supported, or if your results were significant, or not supported if your results were not significant. In terms of a non-significant result, when talking about the null hypothesis, and you can say that the null hypothesis, that you failed to reject the null hypothesis, for instance, you usually want to avoid saying something like you accept the null hypothesis, because just because you conducted a study and you ran a test and the result wasn't significant, it doesn't mean that the null hypothesis is proven to be true. So we generally don't want to say something like we accept the null hypothesis. We simply failed to reject the null hypothesis in this case. So now let's see what other questions we have. So another question is, it seems like most of my tests will need to be non-parametric. Is that considered a negative? I wouldn't necessarily consider that a negative. It really depends on the types of variables that you're using, the level of measurement, and what's really the most appropriate analysis for handling those variables and answering your research questions. It may just happen to be that non-parametric tests are the most appropriate for what you're doing. This will especially be the case if you are using a lot of categorical variables, or variables that aren't continuous, because generally as you move towards categorical levels of measurement, those will more often require non-parametric tests. Or if you're dealing with data that is inherently not normal or doesn't follow normal distributions, then parametric or non-parametric tests may be more appropriate for those types of data. So it's not inherently a negative thing if you're using non-parametric tests. You really just have to use the type of analysis that's most appropriate for the data that you're working with. So another question is, you mentioned answering research question and hypothesis. Should there be an answer to both, or one or the other? And does this occur in a particular part of this section of the dissertation? So that's a good question. So you may have a research question, and for each research question, you have a set of hypotheses associated with that. Usually, if that's the case, so you have a research question plus hypothesis format, you really just need to make a statement about the hypothesis. Like, for instance, the null hypothesis, whether you rejected the null hypothesis or failed to reject the null hypothesis, because that essentially answers your research question, and you're presenting a statement to address your specific hypotheses. It may also be the case that, you know, sometimes you may be doing a project where you just have research questions and you don't have hypotheses. In that case, you want to make sure that you write a specific statement answering your research question. So for instance, if your research question is, you know, is there a relationship between these two variables? You want to make sure you have a clear statement in your results section that says, you know, yes, the results showed that there is a significant relationship between the variables, or no, the results showed that there was not a significant relationship between the two variables. And this information would appear right where you talk about the actual results of the analysis. So again, if you're doing a correlation, you present the results of the correlation coefficient, the p-value, and then you make that statement about whether your null hypothesis was rejected or not rejected, or make a statement about whether there was a relationship or not. And this can also be reiterated in the summary section of the results. So it looks like those are all the questions that were submitted so far. So if anybody has any other questions that you'd like to ask, you can go ahead and submit those questions now. Okay, it doesn't look like we're getting any other questions submitted, so I'm going to go ahead and end our presentation for today. So I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. I hope everyone found it useful. And again, if you are interested in additional support outside of these webinars, you can use the information you see here to contact us and learn more about the types of assistance we provide. And you're also welcome to check out our other webinars on other topics if you're interested in seeing information on other aspects of the dissertation. So again, thanks everyone for attending today, and I hope everyone has a great day.